Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's session on BIC Streams, Aesthetics of Decolonization, Art and Politics in Postcolonial South Asia. I welcome today's panelists, Sanjukta Sunderason and Priyamvada Gopal. Before we start this session, two quick announcements. We will be posting the bios of our panelists in the chat box. Do post your questions in the Q&A box. This session will start with a presentation by Sanjukta, followed by a discussion between Sanjukta and Priyamvada. With that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Sanjukta.
Thank you very much, Raghu, for inviting me to speak. I'm very glad to be able to share the book with you today. It's been a year since the book has been published, so I'm glad that one is getting the chance to talk even now about it. So what I'm going to do today is to present to you some of the thoughts and processes that went into the making of the book, what drove me in developing this argument, but also give you a sense of where the conversation is going in my own head, in further research around it. And also what was interesting and important for me in the book was that what questions it can pose for the connected fields of art and history that I came from being trained as a historian and then working with art history. Also the broader themes of politics, decolonization, and history writing and art history writing in South Asia, South Asian nations, maybe a connected historiography of art in South Asia. So I'll try and touch on these different points, and I'm happy to expand on them in the discussion and further down. So the title of the talk, Aesthetics of Decolonization, for me really is a way of connecting the book and my current work and connecting questions from visual art, historical transition in the subcontinent, and history writing and conceptualization of art history in the subcontinent. So I'll begin by giving you an idea about what, how I kind of organized my thinking around the book as I began the research. So I began my PhD research back in 2007, from which the book arose really, by wanting to work on the artist Chitta Prasad, who by now is very well known in India. In the early noughties, in 2006-07, one saw a series of exhibitions in Delhi. As a student in Delhi, I saw the DAG, the OCEAN exhibitions around Chitta Prasad, and that's when I really came to know of him in the proper sense of the term. And then you recognize a kind of iconography that you would have seen as graffiti on the streets of Calcutta, in communist Calcutta in the 1980s, but also across the country in rural settings, as posters of the All India Students Federation. So I had seen flashes of Chitta Prasad, as it were, but not his work, not him, his authorship as an artist. So that's what led me to work on, decide to work on him and the Bengal famine of 1943. So that's what I wanted to work on. The famine, as many of you would know, happened in 1943, as India by default became a part of the Axis powers, the Second World War, in other words. And Bengal and what is now Bangladesh formed the easternmost frontier of the war. And it is in the context of the famine of the war that the Bengal famine happened in 1943, notorious for being man-made, killing, displacing millions. Amartya Sen's work on the famine, of course, all of you would know. And one of the major arguments was that it was not caused by natural causes or the absence of food, but the lack of access to food, right? So there is a structural critique of capital, of imperialism that is built into the way the Bengal famine unfolded. And it's quite timely to think about how the famine, as a man-made famine, what it did to rural India in the context of India in 2021. It's quite poignant, and it is quite one feels strange talking about the famine in today's context because there are resonances, such strong resonances. So anyway, so I began by working on, and here I've given you photographs of the famine taken by William Vandiver, the American photographer, tied to the Life magazine. And to the left-hand side, you have pictorial representation, reportage on the famine by Chitta Prasad, and the photographs below by the noted photographer on whom there is a lot of work now, Sunil Jana. So this is what I wanted to work on. That took me to a wider field that Chitta Prasad, Jana, etc. were part of, which is what has been retrospectively called the Marxist cultural movement. And I reckon Priyamvada and I would have a conversation, we'll have a conversation around this later. So the cultural movement, the Marxist cultural movement, which began in the field of literature in the late 1930s around the formation of the Progressive Writers Association, under the famine, the formation of the Indian People's Theatre Association in 1943, resonances of which were, active in the field of music, combining political content and folk content in music, in films, early Bombay cinema. So you could see traces of a wider left-wing aesthetic within which Chitta Prasad himself was embedded. For me, I was working within the context of visual art, and that is what I was interested in. And when it came to visual art, I realized that there is no conversation as such. So I kind of realized that there are two things that are happening in the field of visual art around the famine and around the 1940s. One was that there was, and I hope you can see the screen. One was that there is a wider field of what can be called art of the famine, artists who are depicting the famine in their practices. So for example, I've given you a very broad range here. You have the artist Zainul Abedin, who eventually migrated to East Pakistan, became an iconic artist there. Artist in the 40s, he was a teacher at the Calcutta Art College, and who then portrayed the famine on his way from his home to the art school. He would have to literally jump across bodies of destitutes, and that inspired him to do a series, iconic series on the Bengal famine. So you would if you really looked at famine and visual art, you would encounter an artist like Zainul Abedin, or the bottom left image, an artist by then a very famous artist, Devi Prasad Roy Choudhury, working with academic realist style, portraying destitutes. You would have a modernist painter in Shantiniketan like Ramkinkar Baij trying to depict, famine in a very kind of abstract but corporeal way. So as kind of bodies of hunger. You would also have artists in the right-hand side, artists who would eventually form the Calcutta Group in 1943, trying to portray both the famine and destitution and a kind of utopic rural idyll at the same time. And I'll come to these. And then there would be exhibitions like here, I've given you the first page of an exhibition from 44, Bengal Painter's Testimony, where a whole corpus of artworks around the famine would be depicted. So I encountered this body of a wide range of artists really engaging with the famine. And within that, I got a sense of that there is, among these very broad and conglomerate of artists working on the famine, there is a wider convergence that is taking place of art, visual art, the way artists are rethinking their subject, and the way politics is rethinking its subject. So there is a convergence happening between visual art and left-wing politics. The Marxist cultural movement very much shapes this conversation, but is sort of both present and absent in the field of visual art. And it is that kind of simultaneous presence and absence that drew me. When it came to Chitta Prasad, who was my initial interest really, I found paradoxically that he was absent in these conversations. So he, while being an artist associated with the Communist Party of India at that point of time, going into rural India, documenting the famine, eventually in the mid-1940s, developing kind of a protest iconography around anti-colonial resistance in late colonial India, When it came to the field of art discourse, art criticism, writing about artists, exhibitions of artists, and the wider field of modern art in the late colony, Chitta Prasad was absent. So to me, like I said, this paradox of simultaneous visibility and absence of an artist like Chitta Prasad in the 1940s, but also complete erasure of him in post-colonial India, became the subject of what I then ended up working on in the thesis and in the book that developed more on this particular theme. What does art of the famine entail? What are the different ideological nuances and differences within the umbrella of art of the famine? And what makes an artist like Chitta Prasad, who is a committed political artist, appear and disappear from the field of conversations in visual art, in other words? So what the wider subject of the book, let me see. The wider subject of the book, and I'll just take you through some of the key ideas in the book. The subject of the book, precisely this idea of partisan aesthetics, I developed, and I'll explain briefly what it connoted for me. Partisan aesthetics was really then about the coming together, what I called entanglement of two threads that I saw happening, developing in the 1940s. One was shifting notions of modernity in art. What does being modern imply aesthetically in the 1940s? And B, the shifting dynamics of left-wing politics. And both shared one factor, which was a greater commitment to the idea of the people, a greater commitment to the idea of the social, a greater engagement with the field of politics. And I would say field of politics because it was not about committing to a political idea, but engaging with a political idea, trying to participate in a political idea. So that's where the conceptualization of the partisan for me came from, that kind of context. So as a concept, partisan aesthetics does the work of figuring out the terms and the forms and the modalities through which visual art and left-wing politics are approaching each other or converging or entangling. Partisan aesthetics is, to me, not about propaganda or political iconography in art, but what I've called in the book the being and becoming political of art. For me, that being and becoming political of art was tied to a particular period of crisis, particular moment of the convergence of crisis and the activation of crisis in a particular way, what in the Gramscian sense is called conjuncture. But for me, that crisis was not only triggered by the famine as an event in the 1940s, but also in the longue durée sense of how the famine shaped the way imagination, cultural imagination, social imagination from the region, in this case Bengal, pre-partition Bengal and post-partition Bengal, how the famine would continue to impact the way in which aesthetic sensibilities or cultural sensibilities in the region would develop. So not only the Gramscian sense of the conjuncture as a moment of crisis when multiple forces act upon each other, but what Stuart Hall called the cyclical sense of the conjuncture. So a crisis that happens, but a crisis that also persists, keeps coming back, has an afterlife, continues to haunt imagination and experience of a region. So for me, so ultimately partisan aesthetics is also about temporality, the way aesthetic form and historical change, historical transition act upon each other. So what I've called long decolonization in the book is really a way to kind of capture this sense of extended time of art, to make, to say how the political in art develops. So political in art is not about content, it is about a sensibility, but also a sense of struggle of artists, of how to become political. And that's very important, that we really nuance what the political means for artists. So I've just given you the content page here, so you get a sense of how I conceptualize the political. The book has two parts. In the first part, called Dialogues and Dissonances, I look at three different ways or modalities in which this dialogue between art and politics happened. And like I said, dialogue is not just about affirmation, artists becoming members, let's say, of the Communist Party, but also the ways in which the artists rejected that ideology or struggled with that ideology. And I'll take you through the material. I developed 3 ways of looking at it. One was through the idea of political potentiality, the other through the artist as a committed member of the Communist Party, and the third, the Calcutta Group of artists who kind of participated at times and rejected at times. And let me just, and the second part of the book looks at post-colonial displacements, where I look at how this moment of dialogue between art and left-wing politics in the 1940s, what happens when that moment passes. When India gets independence in 1947, also simultaneously a time when the Communist Party itself goes through multiple changes, in fact, becomes way more conservative culturally, a lot of artists remove themselves. So what happens when the movement itself transforms? What happens to that sensibility of radicalism? That was important to me. But also looking at how does displacement that defines the 1940s in a way, the famine is one, the partition is another, how does that sense of displacement or the experience of displacement shape aesthetic imagination in the post-colony? So in a way, the book has 2 different. I'll focus on the first part to give you a sense of the political, because that's what we are focusing on. The first chapter looks at this idea of political potentiality. So in trying to understand Chitta Prasad's presence and absence, and being forced to encounter the Marxist cultural movement more broadly, and wanting to focus still on visual art and not write about the progressive writers, for instance, which is that would be a repetition of scholarship. And I'm very glad Priyamvada is discussing the book, so it will be a great chance to talk about that. I really then went back to artists like Jamini Roy, who were most certainly not communists. But in the 1930s, there is a way in which an artist like Jamini Roy becomes the center of a leftist art criticism that develops with a commitment both to modernism and to socialism. So for me, then this was a kind of antecedent to Chitta Prasad, where artists like Jamini Roy were entered into what I would call an early progressive art criticism, where you have in this photograph here, the poet, the Marxist poet, who also was never a member of the Communist Party, but was a major organizer culturally of what would be seen as progressive culture. Bishnu De wrote on Jamini Roy. There's a broader modernist literary circle in Calcutta, the Partisan Group, who wrote on Jamini Roy and tried to find in his folk modern imagery a kind of commitment or a potential of a socialist future. Jamini Roy himself was very prominent at that point of time, but was often seen as like an urban potua or a scroll painter, but often did not find a kind of modernist vocabulary for his work. And he sought this group. He sought a kind of intellectualization of his aesthetic quest, and he found that among this group of Marxist poets and writers who were also his friends and academics. So in the late 1930s and early 1940s, you have critics like Bishnu De and others who are trying to project on Jamini Roy a political potentiality, that his art can become a new kind of radicalized socialist imagery that turns to the indigenous population or turns to the rural to rethink what modernity would mean. And the rural, very much so overlapping with the Congress discourse, the rural was seen as the site of the nation. In case of Congress, the rural as an unchanging core of purity. But for the Communist Party, the rural then also as a site for a potential activated popular, a revolutionary popular. In the 1930s, of course, the Communist Party was underground, but by the time Bishnu De was writing on him, which was 43, 44, the Communist Party was very much active in the cultural movement. So this political potentiality became a way in which people like Bishnu De would try to bring an iconic artist like Jamini Roy within the fold of the Marxist cultural movement to create a wider narrative. The second modality I found again in the mid-1940s was like people like Chitta Prasad, who, unlike Jamini Roy, were very actively involved in politics. He was a member of the Communist Party. And in the early 1940s, you have Chitta Prasad, going into rural India to document the famine. Before that, he was very much involved in developing an anti-fascist repertoire. The top image here, you find, it's his works for the All India Students Federation. Also the center right image, the Jap octopus, trying to kind of visualize fascism as it's spreading its tentacles over Asia. So he was very much kind of involved in developing an anti-imperialist, anti-fascist vocabulary. And with the famine, he brought into that repertoire a wider visualization of what imperialism was doing in the colonies during the war. And there is a history, of course, to the cultural movement, which was that while the war was on, the Communist Party supported the imperial war effort in defense of the Soviet Union. And there was a way in which they could not actively engage in political protest. So cultural activism, relief efforts around the famine became another way of developing developing the political not as active resistance, but the political as cultural resistance. So in Chitta Prasad, and this as art as agitator and organizer, this is what Chitta Prasad wrote about himself. This is his visualization of his art and art of the Communist Party at that point of time. Post 40s, 45 onwards, two things happen. One is you see artists like Chitta Prasad engaging more strongly with developing imageries of political resistance. So the extreme right-hand side image, this is the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, where, and this kind of imagery, mind you, is not seen in Indian art until that point of time. That's why it is so strange that despite being so radical at that point of time, nobody writes on him. And the bottom image is actually a part of a series of drawings he does for a poster of the India Immortal Ballet, which was an IPTA ballet. And to me, it really, and we can come back to this image, to me, it captures what the Marxist cultural movement really stood for. So I'll just talk about this image a bit. You have in the center a kind of a front of an agrarian figure with sheaves of corn, wheat. Then you have the worker with the insignia of the factory. And then you have the cultural workers. You have the performers lining up in the middle. And on the extreme right-hand side, you have the visualization of the capitalist, both the indigenous capitalist on the floor and then the colonizer being pushed out of the frame, almost, with the ship in the background, resonant of the East India Company and the early colonial mercantile colonialism. And at the back, you have what we would then interpret as insignias of cultural heritage. So classical heritage, Buddhist heritage, you have. So in a way, the cultural movement sees itself as a front of, and it's a very strong socialist, realist vocabulary, which at that point of time is very active in the Soviet Union and the broader socialist solidarities across the world, that the agrarian laborer, the industrial laborer, and the cultural workers are really the front who carry with them traditions of the classical and the folk, and with those as resource, they thwart capitalism, global capitalism, imperial capitalism, but also indigenous capitalism. So that's very much the formulation of the cultural movement of which Chitta Prasad is an active author. The third modality, the third way of art becoming political to me was the formation of the Calcutta Group, who were really a group of modernist artists who had training in both realism and also Bengal school kind of aestheticized sense of, literary, mythological subjects. And the famine really shakes them up. The famine generates in them a kind of urgency to capture the social in their own practices. So the social as an ingredient that must enter the way modern art would be imagined and narrated and created, as it were. Bishnu De, this is a page from Bishnu De writing on them in People's War, the Journal of the Communist Party of India in 1945, I think. Where he sees in their works what he calls concrete contextuality. So a modernism that is rooted in context, and the context in the context of 43, 44, 45 is that of the famine, very much that of the famine. What was very interesting for me to, I'm just checking the time, interesting for me to see in the Calcutta Group was how at times they are drawn to the Communist Party and they are very close friends with Vishnu De. So that's also a way in which that affiliation, that coming together of art and politics happens. At times they are close to it, but by the late 1940s, they really remove themselves from the Communist Party. They reject the Communist Party in a very interesting way. So for me, then that vacillation, that sometimes you engage in a particular ideology, sometimes you don't. So when one thinks about the political in the context of visual art or cultural forms more broadly, I think it's very important for us to understand how affiliation and rejection happen. The rejection, in other words, is as important in understanding the political as is affiliation. So for me, the broader question then became what makes the political in art an unstable category. And tied to all of this is a wider understanding of what progressive art meant in the 1940s and beyond. Now, in the broader audience, I do not know who is in the audience, but I reckon many of you would be familiar with the idea of progressive art in India. And apart from being associated with the Progressive Writers Association, in the field of visual art, when we talk about progressive art, our go-to place is the Bombay Progressive, the Progressive Artists Group in Bombay, who were formed in 1947. And their artists like Hussain, Raza, Francis Souza, Newton Souza, who were all part of the Bombay Progressives. Many of them, like Newton himself, Souza himself, were initially very close to the Communist Party. But by the late 1940s, they removed themselves completely, and in fact wanted to dissociate the word progressive from the left. So there is a way in which progressive art, when we talk about progressive art, not only do we talk about the Bombay progressives, we also do not talk about the left-wing aesthetics, the left-wing cultural movement that really generated the vocabulary, produced that vocabulary. And there is in the book, I call it, from the late 1940s, under Nehruvian India, a simultaneous affirmation and negation of political content in art. So in a way, Nehruvian India is unique because it formulates itself as socialist. It picks up a vocabulary of progressive art that emerges from the 1940s, but also it de-radicalizes it. So the rural remains a content, the rural becomes a modernist content, as one would also see in Hussein's work later, but the radicalism is removed from that. So that's one argument I make. I have this photograph here, this cartoon here, which I found in the archives of the Government College of Art and Crafts. And that really tells me how in the 1940s, modernity in art was visualized in the context of the famine. And you have here the General Roy, the nationalist poet, who it shows an exhibition of modern art where the poet himself is kind of gasping out of his portrait, and he's tearing apart his iconic poetry that talks about the prosperity of the motherland as he looks at these exhibition of modern art in the gallery, which is all about emaciated bodies, vultures piling up skulls, and basically it's a crisis of vision. What does representing the nation consist of in the late colony? In other words, what does, when we talk about art and nationalism in the late colonial India, we often talk about the Bengal school, and we often talk about the idealized imagery of a past or a classical past or a Mughal past. What we often do not end up looking at is the crisis of that composure that happens in the 1940s. So in a way, the 1940s to me is a hinge with which not only we should rethink how art was articulating its modernity in the late colony, but also what Nehruvian India then inherits and transforms. And this is tied to the way in which I also conceptualize the aesthetics of decolonization. And I will not go into that much. Maybe that can come up in the conversation. To me, progressive art and what happens to progressive art in the post-colony really talks about a crisis in which post-colonial nations see themselves or show themselves, or find a visual vocabulary that would then represent the national modern aesthetic. In case of Nehruvian India, it is not an imaginary of displacement, but an imaginary of myth and mythology, and a kind of modernity that then M.F. Hussain, for instance, iconically captures. But if you look at the same modernity through the lens of other artists, and for me, Chitta Prasad becomes that entry point, we see that there is a very different narrative of protest, or narrative of social, dismemberment, of dislocation that continues, but that doesn't really enter the space of the narrative, space of the national narrative, as it were. So the aesthetics of decolonization, by what I mean by the aesthetic of decolonization, is probably important to stress at this point of time. Today, we hear a lot of conversation around decolonizing institutions or a decolonial mode of thinking. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the historical time of decolonization, 1940s to 1970s, a historical time of decolonization where displacement and consolidation are happening at the same time. So this is a time of transition. This is a time of transnational kind of transformations. This is a time in which artists across board, across different decolonizing contexts, are trying to speak to each other as they try and develop what would be then called a third world sense of modernism. Today in the field of art history, we are trying to write about these as we try to decolonize our curriculum and so on. But to me, that's a different concern. If you really enter the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, this kind of period, there is a lot of hidden material, material that is not entirely evident, that hints at how decolonization was being experienced, what are the different ways in which artists were portraying this transformation. And I think that's a different conversation to post-colonial modernisms. So I think in the context of decolonization, we need to develop a transnational framework. In the context of South Asia, for me, it then becomes important to connect what was happening in India in the 50s and 60s, West and East Pakistan in the 50s and 60s, because these really are connected questions. So if one is thinking about art and displacement in South Asia, art and partition in South Asia, it is difficult to do that, I think, by talking about 5 key artists of India. I think it has to be a connected, trans-border conceptualization of how decolonization, in this case partition and simultaneous state formation, inherits the vocabulary of resistance from the 1940s and also inherits a displacement that partition engenders. So that displacement not only in the context of India with the formation of Pakistan, but also for Pakistan and East Pakistan in the context of Bangladesh's liberation war in 71. So how a broader question of displacement really impacts the way we understand aesthetics of decolonization. I probably do not have much time. I'll take 2-3 minutes. Is that okay, Raghu?
Yes,
maybe.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to share with you. This is what I'm trying to work on now. This is where the research more broadly is going. And so these are mainly open-ended questions, methodological questions, really, for the field. One of the ways I'm rethinking what aesthetics of decolonization in a connected trans-border context would mean is around the question of the nation form. So how should the nation be seen and shown? So from an earlier sense, from 36, 46, you have, on one hand, the Nandalal Bose kind of repertoire of a contained rural idyll, and the question of labor being subsumed within a pictorial, an idealized rural. And then you have artists like Chitta Prasad who brought out the resistance dimension, but who themselves disappeared from the scene in the 50s. Chitta Prasad disappeared because he left the Communist Party. He did not like the new turn within the party and he left. And he lived in Bombay as an alcoholic and continued to do the work. But that kind of work were never published, were never circulated. It's only through the context of a private gallery world retrieving these imageries in the 1990s and early 2000s that scholars like me and students, whatever, we come to see this imagery and we get this hidden history of the 1950s that we did not know. Here you had Chitta Prasad writing on Zainul Abidin in the 1940s. Zainul Abidin would later go to Bangladesh and become one of the most iconic artists, really, of East Pakistan, Bangladesh. Abidin and alongside Hussein and an artist like Sadegh Khan in Pakistan, for instance, became in the 1950s creators of new epic narrations of the nation. So you have M.F. Hussain, which all of us know about, Hussein's Zameen, for instance, that creates this gigantic scrolls. And it's very common in the 50s and 60s for artists who take on that responsibility to create these epic narrations of the nation. So you had M.F. Hussein's Zameen, so pictorialization of land, inheritance, nation. You have Sadegh Khan's Treasures of Time, so in a way Islamic cosmopolitanism portrayed and then you have Zainul Abidin in the bottom, Nobanno, which is basically the harvest festival. This is Abidin drawing Nobanno, or the harvest, in 1970, depicting East Pakistan's struggle. And I've written on this. What is very interesting is that you can already see he begins with his famine drawings of the Bengal famine. And then he talks about displacement and arrival and harvest, which is quite telling of the moment East Pakistan was at that point of time, at its moment of arrival into being an independent nation, Bangladesh. Other ways in which the aesthetics of decolonization for me becomes potent is to think about how displacement and struggle asserts itself in post-colonial iconography. So, of course, we have artists like Satish Gujral or Bhavesh Sannal, who I'm working on now, who depicted partition from Delhi in a particular way. Then there are artists in Calcutta who nobody really knew about until a very long time at a national scale, in whose work struggle and had refugees and displacement, not only would they press themselves on the iconography from the region, but also in the works of an artist like Bikash Bhattacharya, destitution will be the modality of depicting abstraction. What is abstraction in art would very much be mediated by the question of destitution. Zainul Abidin's struggle was a persistent theme in Zainul Abidin's work. And to me, that persistence is very important, that what obsesses an artist. And talking about obsession, I very quickly got a chance to look at the question also. Somnath Hoare, an artist who was a member of the Communist Party in the 40s, did his famine works, Tebhaga. In the 50s, he removed himself from the party because he said he realized the party is not going to help him develop his iconography. He was in Delhi in the late 50s, 60s, but he comes back, and he says he comes back because the subject does not leave him. And what is that subject? As a historian, it's very interesting for me to see how Somnath Hoare struggles with the subject. To him, the subject is not only the famine or the memory of the famine, but also in the context of 70s, connecting that memory of displacement and emaciation and almost corporeal violence, bodily violence, connecting that to the far left agitation, the Naxalite agitation in the 1970s, Bangladesh across the border, the Liberation War, Vietnam across many borders, the Vietnam War. So Somnath Hoare's Wound series, which is the cover of the book, for me is the ultimate example of this dialogue between historical time and aesthetic form. I've also given here Zainul Abidin in Bangladesh then in 1973, continuing to work with this repertoire of displacement and death, really. And this was Abidin's work on the Monpura, the tidal, the flood that actually decimated a rural Bangladesh in 70, and he did this work later, almost as if from memory, and continued with this kind of what I see as a haunting presence of realism as an aesthetic style in the modern art of the post-colonies. I'm going to wrap up by talking about how one of the ways in which aesthetics of decolonization, like I said, has to be a transnational conversation, also talks about the ways in which internationalism operated in these colonies. And internationalism operated not just through inspiration from quote unquote, or what art history often obsessively calls influence of often European artists, Euro-American artists, or a kind of the global kind of circulation of abstraction and modernism and so on, but also the different ways in which internationalisms were forming. And there is really a connected conversation between India, Pakistan and Bangladesh possible there because you have artists, cultural thinkers like Faiz Ahmed Faiz, whose music we kind of grew up with in India. But he is a major figure in articulating a post-colonial modernity into the wider history of left-wing internationalisms. Chitta Prasad's image from here, the photograph, which the DAG doesn't have anymore, but to me it's very striking. Chitta Prasad portrays himself, this is sometime in the 50s, himself sitting with the poetry of Nazim Hikmet, the iconic, the Turkish modernist poet, surrounded with Pablo Neruda and the Dove of Peace. And then you have Zainul Abidin, who goes to Jordan in the late 1960s to portray the Palestinian refugees. So there is a way in which artists of the 40s keep returning to the left in different ways and keep articulating internationalism in their work while they remain committed to the political or to the social or to realism as an artistic style. So I do not have any answers on this wider or questions, I would say, around the aesthetics of decolonization project that I'm now writing on. But to me, it's a set of propositions for the field, maybe a set of provocations for the field, where we really get out of the framework of top 5 artists of a country or iconic art movements of a country, or a country for that matter, and try to really problematize the national, not to jump into the global, but to probably return to the locational, what contextual histories say, and see if those contextual histories help us connect to and rethink what internationalism implies, or what kind of trans-border histories and questions we can really ask in 2021, I think. So it's a proposition for the field. And with that, I'm going to end it. And I'm happy to go back to any of these. I probably covered a lot of images in a short time, but here we are. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much. I hope I was, yeah, thank you. I'll stop sharing, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you, Sanjukta. That was incredibly rich and interesting, like your book, which I read in 48 hours and found incredibly rich, but also took me back to my own work of 20 years when I worked on the progressive writers, largely based, of course, in Bombay and Delhi. I think you're quite right to say at the beginning that it's actually really interesting to look at these artists and their work and the debates around it now in the context of the pandemic, which has really interesting family resemblances with what happened during the famine, not least kind of multiple actors who are part of a deep tragedy. Because like the famine, the pandemic brings to fore not just a kind of material disaster, but also hierarchies, also a kind of unequal global order, capitalism, hoarding, unequal access to healthcare. I mean, it is a really remarkable moment of resonance. And you ended with the question of nation and having to kind of undo and rethink that whole category. I wanted to slightly trouble your idea of the Marxist cultural movement, which I know is Sudhir Pradhan's term, and his magnificent 3 volumes under that term bring together really, really rich writers. But as a literary critic, having a conversation with an art historian, for me, what was very striking doing that work on literature and written materials was the status of dissent from the very start, right? So you have Sudhir Pradhan actually beginning with the manifesto that Sajjad Zahir and Mulkraj Anand craft. And from the get-go, this is a troubled productive but troubled alliance. Not everybody is a Marxist. Not everybody's understanding of Marxism is the same. Certainly not everybody is part of the Communist Party. There are, of course, fractures across international communism through the 30s and 40s. So in a sense, the terrain is already contested. And one of the most interesting things, certainly in the literary case, is that these are people who understand the importance of anti-colonial nationalism, which, as you say, is the mode in which the left in India presents itself, but are also very openly and explicitly critical of the national project and are warning from the start that it is a poisoned chalice, that it could lead to trouble unless conceptualized more radically. And I just wondered if some of these arguments, which to me are very present in the literary terrain, if they emerge also in the terrain of art and art history, if there are arguments about nation, if there are arguments about the future. I mean, you talk about potentiality, which I think is really helpful. And I raised the question about arguments because I think, unlike you, perhaps, I slightly disagree that the decolonization of that moment is different from the decolonization of this moment, because actually what is really fruitful, and I've made this argument recently, is that decolonization today only makes sense if we go back to the moment of anti-colonialism. Otherwise, it makes no sense.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Shall I jump in? Shall I?
Yeah, please do.
Oh no, I will not say it's. I guess the differentiation I'm making is also from the context where everybody wants to decolonize everything now. So I often, so in my university, I joined Amsterdam very recently in February, and everybody is talking about decolonizing all the time. Amsterdam University is distributing hours into different programs to decolonize their curriculum. So my response also comes from a slightly defensive position, because I feel I don't want to decolonize anything. I just work on decolonization. And if I develop a curriculum that's based on what I work on, organically, a lot of things will be decolonized by default. So what I mean by that is that the conversations are not different. The problem is that, like the global modernism's conversation of the early 2000s, we want to talk about a contemporary without talking about its antecedents. So what you're saying about that, we have to return to the 20th century. We have to return to the 20th century to understand what decolonization meant at that point of time. So, you have an activist, poet, politician like M.S. Césaire in 50s talking about decolonization both in the political sense and in the cultural sense. Already in the 50s. So I think there is a wider archive of decolonizations that lingering in the 20th century that we maybe as researchers are going back to slowly. But as pedagogues, often for multiple constraints, we are not being able to bring that to curriculum. So my differentiation of decolonization now and 20th century is based on that. I want to basically join both. I do not want the fetishization of the contemporary that is happening, and the art world and the world of documenta and everything. They are very high on the contemporary decolonization conversation, while at the same time not really allowing these plural stories, the plural archive of 20th century decolonization in the field of visual art to emerge. Because often artists who were really invested in rethinking a radical vocabulary were not artists who ended up becoming dominant. So, so that's why I said this hidden history of both absence and presence. So absence really is something that I am interested in unpacking. So that's more or less my kind of thinking along with you in the second half of the question. The first, Marxist cultural movement and the vocabulary of it. Yes, absolutely. I have to say, back in 2007, when I started the work, your book was very, very helpful, because there weren't that many books on the Marxist, on the left-wing aesthetics at that point of time. So you can imagine that I very much began the work by, looking at your book for sure. Sudhir Pradhan's work is a compendium. It's an archival work, right? So it's not, and Sudhir Pradhan also occupies a particular position in the history of the cultural movement. He's very much a part of it. He's very much kind of within the context of how the party unfolded, in other words. In literature, the conversations are more, how do I say this, more active and articulate than in visual art. And that's not because there is no conversation. It is because it doesn't add up to anything. So it remains separate, isolated. So you have Chitta Prasad writing in little pieces in, the party's organs, whether it is Oroni, the periodical I take his writing from, Nobody knows about these. Even if they don't know, they do not know what to do with it, because the questions in art history writing has been so much dependent on the artist as hero, or a dominant cultural, dominant art movement, that we are really not methodologically conditioned to look at non-spectacular sites. And there is no manifesto. So a huge archive of the Progressive Writers Association would be tied to the conferences of the Progressive Writers Association, the manifestos and the rethinking. In the field of visual art, that's not there. What is there is Mulk Raj coming to gatherings of the Porichai Circle in Calcutta in 1938, when he's hanging out in Calcutta. And he comes and he talks to Sudhindranath Datta, who has been at that point of time writing on Jamini Roy. Together, they discuss what the scopes of the popular are, what should the people mean in visual art. And then Mulk Raj Anand writes in 1940s about Jamini Roy that, only if he could be slightly more radical. Right? So it's a desire. So there is no manifesto. There are these disembodied conversations. And then there is this desire. Only if he could, only if his subjects could be workers, Vishnudev says. Only if he could take his sensibility, folk modern sensibility, to the cries of the working class, they say. But Jamini Roy doesn't do that. So so for me, in the field of visual art, when I had to think about what is the left, I had to radically change the questions. Methodologically. Otherwise, I will never find anything, because it is not out there. That's why I said rejection and vacillation became important for me, because there is no consistent, coherent position. So as a historian, then I have to make sense of the incoherence. Right?
Can I, slightly push you on the question of the people, because you do talk about it. You use a wonderful, you talk about it as a plural, ambiguous, malleable category, which and it seems to me that question has not gone away. Who are the people, and the people is of course invoked multiply in these debates about the future nation, the nation that is about to come into being. Who are the people of India? I wonder who the people are in some of these debates. The famine, obviously, in a sense, the famine victim emerges as one element of the people. I suppose slightly to push at your argument from the literary angle. One of the ways in which the people is talked about in the literary debates is to say we need to talk about the diversity of those who will constitute this nation, and the fact that there are multiple competing interests. Where, for instance, is caste in the discussion of the people? And there's a question in the box, which I also had reading this. Women enter your narrative quite late in the day. I think in the 60s and 70s, there is discussion of women artists. And this is not a hostile question, because I've just written a book on anti-colonial thought that is largely about men. That is the terrain as it establishes itself. But is there a discussion about who the people are, and what are the kind of multiple axes on which that category is constituted?
Yeah, I think, no, thanks for these questions. While writing, I was very aware of those. See, caste is, it's a tricky conversation. Because it's a particular social class that then becomes the articulators of Marxist consciousness. Caste is almost a kind of, how do I say this? A kind of unconscious, the political unconscious becomes caste, and there is a wider discussion around late colonial primitivism, where poets like Vishnudev or artists of the Calcutta Group then go into the Santal Parganas and portray indigenous subjects as this kind of, as the people, really. The tragedy is that the people always then become very much a kind of projection, which Prathama Banerjee, etc., have talked about, how then that a tribal imaginary becomes one major part of the Marxist imaginary of the people. Chitta Prasad, in his case, the people is also, there was in one of the BBC, I think it was The Thick of It, where one of the politicians, he's talking about using the word people in one of the policies, and one of his staff members says, don't use people, it sounds communist. Right. So I was like, that's bang on, because the people in the context of the left in the 30s and 40s very much is in the context of the International Popular Front. So people is something that Gandhi, of course, uses, but then people is something that the Communist International actively is using. So the people is very much the revolutionary popular. That is what distinguishes the leftist communist vision of the people from the Gandhian notion of people, with which it's deeply entangled, organically, genetically entangled almost. And a person like Jamini Roy then has one sense of the people, which is a Gandhian one. But the critics who are writing on him, and those writings he likes very much, is the Marxist sense of the people. So that's why, to me, it was important to stress the ambiguity and the malleability of the category. So I think the people is at one point a malleable, revolutionary, popular, but it is also at another point, the sense Partha Minter has talked about it, this contained urban other, which then the artists go, even in the 40s, go deep into the Santhal Parganas to portray a kind of landscape and tribal subjects as a kind of modernist space. So that's both there. The conversation becomes very complicated in Nehruvian India, and that's where the space of women artists and women as protagonists of a new visualization of the people comes up. And I've written on this in a separate article recently, because I worked a lot on Meera Mukherjee, but she didn't enter the book. So she has, so I've recently written on her separately. You see artists like Meera Mukherjee who are very much engaged with the left-wing discourse, and who in the 50s pick up that momentum of the cultural movement, which is disbanded at a national scale, but which returns to the indigenous as a space via Nehruvian projects. And a person like Meera Mukherjee then goes to Bastar and travels all over India, to be honest, to bring the folk and the space of the craft and the space of the indigenous into a modernist vocabulary. Now, it is rife with contradictions. And the problem is we are so geared to writing artist-driven art histories that the contradictions somehow do not find space. So I think for the contradictions to find space, one has to then really enter art history through questions like, who are the people? And that was one of the critiques I made around, an exhibition like Place for People that would happen in 1881 in Delhi, and which is seen as this moment of return to the narrative in Indian art. And my critique of that was that people is a longue durée category in Indian art, forget Indian politics. But to ask those questions, we really have to rethink what our entry points would be. So I think
of discussion here in terms of the argument that you make, which I think is familiar also from the literary sphere, which is to say that in the post-independence moment, the energies of the artist as agitator, the writer as polemicist, the radical writer are in a sense siphoned off by state institutions. So the Sahitya Academy or the Lalit Kala Academy become official keepers of the people and of realism and indeed of the progressive.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you think that is the entirety of the story, which is to say, and I don't think you do, in fact, is there a dissident milieu still that is not part of the institutionalized scene or indeed the high art market? But is there a wider cultural scene that we can talk about in terms of its dissident energies today, where the discussion has shifted quite a lot from the 1940s and 50s? Some of those questions are still with us, but now we are at a different moment where, in a sense, the main fault line is between kind of liberal nationalism and Hindu nationalism. And where is this kind of, is there a space for radical art and literature, a space for the nation and the people, conceptualized differently, conceptualized in the open-ended way you alluded to at the end of your talk?
Yeah, gosh, thank you. That's a wider methodological question that's what I do. And having said that, the book ended with that possibility of how to approach. So, well, the quickest response would be no. Lalit Kala Academy and Bombay Progressives, or Bombay or Delhi for that matter, are not the only answers to what was post-colonial modernism. For what it's worth, that has dominated art history writing. And we are that much better for it because we have that material, that lineage of art history writing. But the question is, where do we go from there? For me, there are two things. How do you move beyond a Bombay and Delhi centric? And by Bombay and Delhi, I don't mean the cities, I mean the institutions and the market that it. It's not like in the 50s and 60s, there was an active art world out there. Yeah, even there, artists were struggling to form spaces. But there were certain kinds of patronage that were available in Delhi and Bombay that might not have been the case in other parts of the country. So for me, to go beyond Lalit Kala Academy or to go beyond institutional sites is a question of not just going beyond these centers or decentering the question around modernism. It's not about the center at all. It is connected to that, but not about the center. It's not a question of decentering, but it's really to think about the question of marginality. So to talk about margins, not to bring them into focus and do some kind of historical justice, but to really think from the margins. So for a very long time, if I sit and argue that post-colonial Bengal is a margin, there might be people who say, oh no, but everything has been about Bengal. No, everything has not been about Bengal. Post-47, you don't see the space being talked about. And the question is why? Because partition does something. It displaces a particular, let's say, it creates a kind of discomfort, which Nehruvian India might not be by default interested in. So in this case, in the book, I talk about the marginality of a post-partition site of Bengal. But that question of marginality can be taken to northeastern India. That question of marginality can be taken to Kashmir. And if we start asking questions from there historically, there might be ways of really rethinking what post-colonial India really means, and also what decolonizing India would look like. So I often feel in certain conversations that one is part of, that I feel decolonizing now is very much a Western concern. And I understand that should happen, but not at the timeline set by the West. When it comes to contexts like India, is the country interested in decolonizing? If it is, it really has to go back to a history that we ironically have to protect now. Yeah. So in a way, that dialectic between preserving a history and animating that history from what that history marginalized, right? Does that make sense? So really thinking about 50 Nehruvian India via the question of marginality. Does that make sense? So I'm thinking aloud as I
think I would just say one thing, and this is me drawing on recent work I've done, which is actually, it's not quite true, despite the salience of the Western Academy, that decolonization...
No, it's not quite true. No.
And it actually comes not from India, it comes to us from Africa.
Of course.
So it comes to us from Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, where, in fact, in the 60s, the question of decolonization was put very squarely on the table.
Absolutely.
And the great theorists of decolonization have not been from India. And that is, again, for interesting historical reasons, because India witnesses a transfer of power. India never undergoes decolonization, right?
No.
So in a sense, I wanted to also ask you about your use of the kind of longue durée of decolonization. You are talking about a context that has signally failed to decolonize, that has never really even posed the question after the 1940s and 50s. Whereas in Africa, in the 60s, right into the 80s, how do we decolonize becomes very salient, and it becomes part of a people's movement in a way that it wasn't
in
any South Asian context.
Yeah.
You do use the term decolonization, and for better or for worse, it's part of the debate now. And you did say when you were giving your talk that perhaps that's something we could talk about in Q&A. Would you like to say more about that?
Yes, I would very much like to say more about that. Thank you because I don't think I addressed it in the talk. I was looking at the watch and this and that. Look, I'm interested in the idea of freedom and the dialectics of freedom and the vocabularies of freedom. Is it independence? Is it emancipation? Is it liberation? What? I would not say South Asia does not have that conversation. India might not, or what we understand as India might not. But there are parts of India that had that conversation about the limits of freedom, what freedom meant. Pakistan has that conversation. Pakistan has that conversation in the 1950s, in the 1960s, even as Faiz Ahmed Faiz becomes a part of the national apparatus. There is that energy of this, how do I say this melancholia about what independence has brought. That melancholia is very active in Pakistan, West Pakistan at that point of time. And that generates plural thoughts. Now, whether that is Manto, who you will know is very, very dissatisfied with what freedom has brought and really activates the question of what is freedom. That's there in Faiz Ahmed Faiz's writings also by the 70s, 80s, and the 50s. So in the 60s, it's a different. So there are these nuances within these iconic figures. And it's really what kind of questions we are willing to ask. So there is conversation. Chitta Prasad is a person who, in a letter says, he says in Bengali, Bhejal, it's a poem he's writing to another poet. And he talks about Bhejal itihasher deshe, right? So in a nation of tainted histories. What does that mean? My thing for understanding the historical time of decolonization is also to understand the plural vocabularies through which artists, in my case, or critics who are writing on art, are really trying to conceptualize what independence has brought. So in a way, I'm interested, let's say, in histories of not affirmation, but disenchantment of some kind. Even as one is aware that Faiz becomes the nation, but it is Faiz becomes the nation, Manto becomes the nation. That's the 21st century excitement we inhabit. But that was not the case. Faiz was imprisoned in the 50s. Manto, became an alcoholic and died in the 50s. So there is a way in which freedom generated disenchantment. And that's there in the works of poets and artists in India too. In Bangladesh, for instance, in East Pakistan, you have this very foundational question of what freedom is this? What should we do now? Where does one belong? So to me, those things are there, but the archive is such, or the non-archive is such, that your questions have to be malleable while your larger, how do I say this? Larger, goal, something remains one. In my case, that's freedom, really looking at what are the
only thing is that there's a slight difference, which you actually point to, between the discussions around azadi or freedom, which Faiz also picks up azadi, and of course very famously says, ye daag ujala, and questions the subeh azadi.
Yeah.
And decolonization as posed, I think it is quite important to underline the African origins of decolonization as a term that we now discuss, because freedom, while it's connected, is easily appropriated into the discourses of, well, we are free, we are Indian, right? Or we are Pakistani, or we are Bangladeshi. The state is free, and therefore, in a sense, it's a moment of the end of history. And embracing capitalism and consumer choice, that's freedom. Mm-hmm. Decolonization has always posed more tough questions about what happens when the colonizer leaves. Mm-hmm. And you are free in one sense, but actually you have failed to change the structures of the state and the structures of inequality, distribution, and transformation that you should be thinking about. And I do think that that for all that we have Faiz, and even Nehru himself for that matter, the discussion coming out of the Caribbean and out of West Africa and East Africa is much more profound on thinking about the radical change needed. But if you think about it in an Afro-Asian frame, it is still valid. And I do think that I would say that it is not a given that we are decolonized. It is not a given that when you and I teach what we teach, our courses are decolonized. I mean, I'm quite profoundly aware, because I'm in a context where we challenge whiteness. Mm-hmm. I'm quite aware that when I teach a post-colonial literature course, all the writers are upper caste, just again, by default. And so for me, decolonization means having to think much, much harder about the question of caste and about exactly the questions of the margins that you raise. So that's, I mean, that's just a sort of comment. You call for at the end of your book, for a radical rethinking of place. Yeah. And I think you tie that into your understanding of decolonization. Is that something you can talk about a little bit more?
Yeah, well, radical rethinking of place in multiple ways, right? So one is the margins as the sites of production and the site of question. So that's one. But place also as historiography. Who am I going to make protagonist in my book? Is the history a protagonist? Is the contradiction a protagonist? Is a figure a protagonist? What does that mean? In case of Chitta Prasad, post-colonial Chitta Prasad, is absence a protagonist? Can we really think through absence? When the artist actually rejects the Communist Party, he rejects Bombay's art worlds, right? And he participates over with Czechoslovakian art spheres, for instance. So for me, the place is a question of the location, but also who is the protagonist in your, what is the historiographical place? So that is one thing. Look, freedom is a plural category. That's why I'm talking about vocabularies of freedom. For example, when you said, I was recently doing a grant application and I was thinking of calling it Arts of Liberation, and my partner said, just be careful, the committee might think it's Maoist. So, which is very productive, right? Because, in the 70s, the journal of Maoist politics, and it's called Liberation, right? And then you have a critic like Marcuse writing about, aesthetics, that, aesthetic form should be the way through which we should understand the question of liberation in the 20th century. So for me, freedom is a spectrum, and not only freedom as independence, I don't think that comes up much, but also freedom as the freedom of the artist. So there are three different versions. So my current work really, and maybe that will explain where I am with this. My current work is basically looking at the dialogues between decolonization, modernism, and socialism. So I look at plural ways in plural and contradictory notions of freedom that are operating, and how artists navigate themselves through this field during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I am basically looking at a 10-year span when I'm going to work on this book. And yeah, Africa, to me also the Arab world, and this work, Priyamvada, has to be a collaborative one.
Yes,
because so there is a way in which I can access the présence africaine, kind of the African conversation, but there is so much of Africa we have no clue about. So we wherever our protagonists are speaking, and we have so much, you're very right, decolonial thinking coming out of Africa, but we know very little because very little has been published from the context of Asia. Arab writing is either in French or Arabic. So there is a lot of rethinking about what freedom has meant. And they are talking about it in the 70s in this journal Lotus that I've began working on. I've published a bit. Very actively, you have poets and writers and artists talking about the question of freedom. So when I say freedom, it's a plural and contradictory terrain, but it's also a question of what is the archive of freedoms. And that's not a quick answer, really. It's a very plural field. So that's what I'm saying. It's not a topic of research. Maybe it's a disposition of research, that this is what I'm interested in understanding. And that would take me to multiple places. Africa, for sure. But what becomes Africa is also a question, like, what is Africa? So, so
I think one very suggestive aspect, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, one suggestive aspect of the moment that you draw out, and that is embedded in that moment. And I think it's very valuable in India to think about this, India in the present, which is in the progressives of all sorts, of multiple, dispositions, understood that you could not have anti-colonialism without anti-fascism, and you couldn't have anti-fascism without anti-colonialism. And I think that that is a signal legacy that it's worth putting back into play, which is to say, it's not enough to say we are independent India and we are culturally proud and we are great and our civilization goes back 2,000 years. You are also obligated to challenge fascism, right? And that means it's not simple. And that means then the whole debate is considerably more complex than some key players would like to see it. I mean, there is also a profound misusing of decolonization that we see in Indian politics
or
today.
It's happening in a way in India that we do not have the conceptual vocabulary for. Somewhere I feel I am failing, or maybe the left in India has failed at a massive level. But then this point about anti-fascism, I just want to, that's a very, very correct. So in a way, going back to this legacy of the progressive and really confronting that very aptly. So in one of the book talks, somebody asked me, so what about the far right nationalist, how the idea of the wound and art in the context of the right wing globally and India and so on. And I said, people have worked on right-wing nationalism and culture in India. So I'm happy that scholarship exists. I'm not interested in it. I will be interested when the right-wing nationalist thinking and culture around it, or critical culture around it, conceptualizes fascism in the context of Hindu nationalism. If you do that, then there is something new coming. So now in the past couple of years, I hear the word fascism being talked about. But that's a recent thing, isn't it? In the context of thinking about India and the way right-wing nationalism is developing in the context of South Asia, I would say more broadly. So in a way, you're very correct. I think there is a way in which one has to return again to the mid-20th century and understand how anti-fascism and anti-imperialism spoke to each other. And maybe one needs to return to that inheritance and the contradictions of that inheritance, where the political left, let's say, in my work, I try to make a differentiation between political left and cultural left, because I think that's important. Otherwise, one writes another book glorifying the Marxist cultural movement. And I personally have no patience for that. Because there's a way in which globally the political left is either diffused or the center is not holding, right? So there is a way in which cultural left or a more plural left is ready for a change in conversation, but you often do not find those platforms. And that's why our classrooms become important, right? Or one's pedagogy becomes important. So yes, a big yes. I'm rambling, but a big yes.
No, it's fine. I think that's a very good note on which to pause our conversation and perhaps hand over for Q&A from the audience in the 10.
Yes, I'm trying to look at the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanjukta and Priyamvada. That was absolutely fantastic. We have two questions. One is by Anusha Prakash. I think Sanjukta sort of addressed that a bit. Would you like to say something more on the women that you encountered, Sanjukta, or we can skip that?
Well, a quick answer would be, I do not encounter women in the non-archive that I have studied. And when I say non-archive, I mean a very broad range of kind of incomplete traces of periodicals and a lot of women activists in IPTA, of course. So this is not about the absence of women. IPTA had women composers, designers, performers. A person like Meera Mukherjee, later I found in the 40s, she was doing some work around the famine. It impacted her, but I have not encountered much. Pradosh Dasgupta's wife, Kamala Dasgupta, was working in the 40s, but she was not very active within the group. So in a way, the absence could be a point of entry. But I will just tell you from the archive, that is not to say that was not happening, but I didn't encounter it in the archive. A non-archive. It's not like it's out there and we go and study. I didn't see that. But in the field of later within the left's cultural movement, there were many prominent women, very much so. Yeah, so it's not a question of absence in discourse. It's not an absence in discourse, let's say.
I also wonder if it has to do with how people can work. Like, Rashid Jahan and Ismat Chughtai and all these very prominent women.
Yeah.
They're able to write in between cooking and in the evenings at night after the children have gone to bed. Painting or an art and sculpture, I think, requires a different kind of chunk of time, perhaps, that you need. So it's also about the kind of what kinds of work you are able to do in a gendered life.
I think that's worth thinking about. I mean, for me, in the 50s and 60s, that becomes a stronger question. But yeah, I think the kind of work, also the documentational kind of work that an artist like Chitta Prasad does, traveling in Midnapur, traveling in what was then Chittagong, in undivided India, it's a kind of work, very much so. The modality of working, that's a factor. Yeah.
The next question is from Abhijit Sengupta, who asked about the issues of caste that Priyamvada raised. The issue of caste raised by Ms. Gopal is interesting because it questions the relative role of the Marxist movement in caste removal. We always go into tribal issues, which is very different. Even Chitta Prasad was a Bhattacharya.
Chitta Prasad actually hardly ever wrote his surname. He would always prefer to be called Chitta Prasad. But I often see that people refer to him as Chitta Prasad Bhattacharya. Yes, of course, the caste is a big kind of, how do I say this, a blind spot in very much in the consciousness of this period. I would say later periods also, but yeah.
So Anusha Prakash, who asked the first question on the women, has made a comment that's so true. Plus, it's a question of poor documentation, possibly. Thank you for answering the question.
True, poor documentation.
So the last question for today is from Smriti Kopikar. Thank you for an amazing presentation and enlightening discussion. Decolonization of India now also sort of encompasses the unmaking of early independent India, in that those symbols and markers are considered less Indian and less Hindu. For example, Lutyens' Delhi now sought to be demolished and unmade. How do you see this?
Well, I'm not for any demolition of any kind. I feel confrontation is much better and much more taxing to do. India is going through a decolonization in its own terms. And I do not think many people, and this is my self-flagellation moment, I do not think people on the left, scholars on the left, we have fully understood something. I do not have an answer. I think this is a decolonization of a kind that we do not have the vocabulary for. I can easily call it a regression. I think it is regression. I think it's a selective, I can give you all the answers that we can quickly give, like it's a majoritarian view of India. I can also say that late colonial India, and post-colonial India always had a majoritarian unconscious. I often say that India is not a country of fascists, it's a country of Muslim-hating centrists. I think it's a centrist country which can veer any time because there is a suspicion of the other all the time and an impatience around the margins all the time. Now, many of these are built into the rationality of Nehruvian India. That's why I said we ironically have to both, for want of a better expression, we ironically have to protect Nehruvian India and critique Nehruvian India at the same time. So this is also the time when historians like us and many other friends of mine are going back to the Nehruvian archive, which, by the way, is very difficult to access, to really then critique the unconscious of post-colonial India. But then we have to do it at a time when all that the country somehow managed to project to itself and the world is quite foundationally challenged. And to me, somehow both has to happen together. For me now, I can only observe. What's happening in India now is something I can only observe. I have nothing to say. I think it is valid to say that one is shocked and this is not the way. But then if the country has a different answer, as a historian, I can only listen and continue to do my work, I would say. That's not an answer, but that's what I have to say. It's profoundly disappointing.
On that note, thank you so much, Sanjukta. Although we don't have much clarity on that front, it was rare to see clarity in the conversation on such complex subjects that were spoken about today. Thank you again, Sanjukta. Thank you, Priyamvada.
Thank you very
and
much.
Thank you, our audiences, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Raghu, Priyamvada. Thank you. Take care, all of you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.